Hello everybody and welcome to the De Morgan Foundation's online lecture series. Today it's my pleasure to welcome Hannah Squire. Hannah is a Pre-Raphaelite expert and shares her incredible knowledge about this Victorian art movement with audiences in such a wide range and variety of spaces through the Pre-Raphaelite Society podcast and Instagram pages, and by writing academic texts for publications and organising exhibitions as well, such as the Look Beneath the Lustre exhibition about the De Morgans at Wightwick Manor and Beyond Ophelia, one of the only exhibitions that's ever focused on the life and works of Lizzie Siddall. So it's my pleasure to welcome you today, Hannah. Thank you so much for doing this talk for us.
Oh, hello everyone. Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks for everybody that joined. Can I just preface by saying I didn't call myself a Pre-Raphaelite expert. I didn't say, Sarah, definitely say this, so that wasn't me, but thank you. So I'm sorry it's taken over a year for part 2 of this sunflower talk, but my migraines have made it really hard to look at screens for any length of time. So you can imagine the issues this has caused. And if you haven't watched part 1 about the sunflower and would like to, please look up and subscribe to the De Morgan Foundation channel on YouTube and search for sunflowers. And to recap the first talk, I thought I'd just show you a few of the slides from it and give you kind of a brief overview to put this in context. So let me just quickly go back. There we are. So both of these talks developed from the exhibition I curated with Sarah that she mentioned in the autumn of 2019 at Wightwick Manor, a National Trust property in Wolverhampton. You can see here the exhibition on the right. The exhibition, entitled Look Beneath the Lustre, is in the De Morgan Gallery, and the exhibition is still there and ongoing if you'd like to see it. And one of the themes in the exhibition was looking at inspiring movements, and particularly how the aesthetic movement inspired both the De Morgans and the Manders and Wightwick Manor itself. And in the last lecture, I talked about the links between Oscar Wilde and Wightwick and the prevalence of the sunflower in all art forms of the late 19th century because, quote, "There is no flower so purely decorative as the sunflower. It is so perfectly adaptable for decorative art because its form is definite and perfect." That was spoken by champion of the aesthetic art for art's sake movement, playwright and art critic Oscar Wilde. And part 1 of this talk began by outlining how the sunflower became the symbol of aestheticism in late 19th century Britain, and therefore how Wilde himself became closely associated with the flower, and the many caricatures, of which you can see a few here, of him, in which the sunflower is ever present, along with other symbols and ideas associated with the movement. Also in part 1, I unpacked the Gesamtkunstwerk. Let me just get to that, the total work of art that represents the interiors of Wightwick and Standen. So examples that speak to us of the many aesthetic homes of the era, filled with example of the sunflower motif. So you can see here examples of the sunflower in both National Trust properties. And also I talked about, of course, the iconic Peacock Room by Whistler and the inclusion of sunflowers in this space. From tiles to wall sconces, fabrics, wallpapers, adverts, ceramics, stained glass windows, fashion and opera. This new style in home decoration, architecture and fashion represents the rebelliousness of the aesthetic movement and how you can embody these new ideas in the sunflower motif, or more abstractly, the pervasiveness of yellow in particular as a sign of subversion and new thinking. I also talked about the innovative, rebellious new Grosvenor Gallery, here shown in the engraving on the left, and how the colours of yellow and green became intimately associated with this new progressive centre of the art world. Both the Grosvenor Gallery's advocacy of women artists, the new freedom in women's fashion, the ability of women to move unrestricted with the loose aesthetic dress, often depicted in the colours of yellow and green, and sometimes these dresses have a sunflower print, or the sunflower as an extra adornment in portraits and caricatures of the dresses, as you can see here. And also, interestingly, in the United States specifically, the sunflower at this time was a symbol of the women's suffrage movement there. So the flower in all these ways was directly linked with the greater freedom of women, a new and light and aged, helped by the sunflower's preoccupation with the sun, the idea of the new woman, and the celebration of femininity and Mother Nature in opposition to industrialization. In fact, sorry, now I keep going back quite quickly between a few slides. That won't happen from now on. In fact, the image I've used on the title slide here for this lecture is a painting by a female American artist, Mary Cassatt, painted in 1905. It depicts a mother wearing what appears to be a loose aesthetic dress in yellow and green. She's in a domestic setting with a young child and is of course wearing a large, bold sunflower, which would have all the connotations I just mentioned the viewers would notice at the time. The inclusion of the child here on her lap speaks to women teaching the next generation these new roles and denouncing the old strict Victorian boundaries and moralities, as well as showcasing her femininity. This was something the UK suffragettes and suffragists also cultivated as part of their image, in opposition to the press's smear campaign to depict women who fought for their rights as being terrible mothers and rejecting the home entirely. Cassatt, like Constance and Oscar Wilde and William and Evelyn de Morgan, advocated for women's rights and women's suffrage, so the right for women to vote. In the last lecture, I also talked particularly about the sunflower as a subject in art in its own right, for example, in paintings by Barbara Beaudeschon, in which I also evoked her feminist thinking by showing the heights these sunflowers can grow to and thrive in. Interestingly, also, the worship of sunlight by sunflowers and also by the mythological figure Clytie, who I'll talk quite a bit about in this lecture, is interesting to think about in terms of the Victorian era's preoccupation with paleness and staying out of the sun to donate wealth and prosperity, which is in kind of direct opposition to the aesthetic movement's embrace of the sunflower. In this lecture, I want to dive deeper into the sunflower's association with women and mythology in art, the various examples of its depiction by artists from Julia Margaret Cameron's photography to Evelyn de Morgan's Clytie and Edward Burne-Jones' stained glass windows. So to begin is this striking photograph by pioneering photographer Julia Margaret Cameron, simply entitled The Sunflower. Created in the early 1870s, it might seem to be too early to be considered part of the movement, but though the aesthetic movement gained popular success in the 1880s, we can trace the origins of the movement back to the 1860s. Cameron also had aesthetic connections, setting up a studio at her sister's house at Holland Park. Her sister's salon hosted leaders in the movement who sat for Cameron, including G.F. Watts and Marie Spartali Stillman. In the photograph, you can see, can I just check, Sarah, because on my camera, my face is kind of covering the sunflower photograph, which is a bit disconcerting, and I wanted to check that's not what everybody else is seeing. If Sarah can unmute herself. No, okay, that's fine. I'll just carry on and hope that you can all see the full sunflower image there, and I'm not covering it as I am for myself. So yes, so in the photograph, 3 sunflowers are seen, one in the background, which is rooted and growing and towering above the woman in the foreground. The other 2 she has picked, and one is resting on her lap in her right hand, and the other is placed in front of her dress with her left hand resting below to catch it if it falls out. The wild, untamed nature of her hair, which nearly touches the petals of the sunflower behind her, and her butterfly adornment, along with her face turning towards the light as sunflowers were thought to, and the simple title of this artwork suggests that she's a personification of the plant itself. In another of Cameron's photographs, created about the same time, called The Passion Flower at the Gate, a young woman stands at the gate, looking longing off into the distance, and that's another example of her kind of representing a flower in the female form. Interestingly, though, in the Passion Flower at the Gate and other examples of women representing flowers by Cameron, they're usually dressed very differently, in simple dark colours or in contemporary Victorian fashion or in medieval fashion. In comparison here, in this photograph of the sunflower, she's wearing a loose fitting Grecian-inspired garment, and her gaze is really preoccupied with something to her right, where the flower is, where the light is coming from, as if she is looking at the sun. Both of these suggest to me that Cameron is referencing the myth of Clytie here, which is the water nymph from Greek mythology, although Clytie's name is not mentioned in the title at all. The female figure's here's body is bathed in light to perhaps suggest the sunlight, in contrast to the very dark background. In another photograph Cameron created of a single female figure entitled The Wildflower, The artwork is an allegorical representation of the ideas expressed in a William Blake poem. And although these lines are quoted underneath the photograph, and in this photograph there is no extra text apart from the title and her name, I do think the allusions here to Clytie are undeniable. Referencing Greek myths is another interesting aspect of the aesthetic movement, with its focus on beauty above all else. The discussion of the appreciation of beauty arose in Western societies from ancient Greek philosophers such as Plato, Pythagoras, and Aristotle. These philosophers explored aesthetics using empirical and moral methods. Beauty is one of the highest forms of goodness on earth, and attempted to quantify the mathematical properties of beauty. Initially, the field of Greek studies stressed morality. However, it was the 19th century aesthetes who transformed the field into one of dissension, in opposition to the Victorian society they found themselves in. And figures like Oscar Wilde looked to the homosociability of the Greek world to define and describe his own same-sex love. Wilde, for example, is quoted as saying in 1881, "I have long ago ceased to care what newspapers write about me, my time being all given up to the gods and the Greeks." Re-establishing the Greek concept of hedonism, so chasing pleasure and beauty as life's purpose. With the Greek mythological figures of Narcissus, which was personified in an artwork of Oscar Wilde we talked about in the first lecture, and Clytie, who we'll talk about a lot in this lecture, both have this preoccupation with beauty, and they're kind of representations of this aesthetic ideal. Speaking of Clytie, let's now move back to talking about another female artist depiction of both the sunflower and Clytie herself, from Evelyn de Morgan. Returning to the Look Beneath the Lustre exhibition at Wightwick Manor, as well as her husband William, Evelyn de Morgan was influenced and inspired the aesthetic movement, including using the motifs of the sunflower, the lily, and the peacock. Her art also champions the value of colour and form through her rich palette and the importance of beauty in nature and the female form in her artworks. Evelyn's creations also express her interest in poetry and focus on inspiring a particular mood through deep emotions, very aesthetic. From a young age, Evelyn de Morgan had a drawing tutor and created drawings studied from nature. Drawing flowers, like learning to play the piano, was an acceptable feminine pastime for Victorian middle-class women and girls, though the bold, large size of Evelyn's sketches, which you can see in the photograph to the right in the cabinet, kind of gives you a sense of how large this drawing of the sunflower is, that can't dare to be ignored, and which may also, I think this is also probably a study for a later Clytie painting, are kind of in opposition to this patriarchal idea of small watercolours produced in the domestic sphere by women that could be done in between domestic duties and take up little space. These detailed sketches of flowers show Evelyn's close observation skills. The plants are painted in quite realistic detail. And though Evelyn was not a member of the Pre-Raphaelite movement, an art movement that began 30 years before she became an artist, she was influenced by their radical belief that studying nature in all its details was incredibly important for creating art. And I included a few of the sketches Evelyn made for nature in the exhibition to show both her attention to detail when drawing from nature, but also show her interest in creating designs of sunflowers and also the lily below it, you can see in the cabinet. Also another favourite of aesthetic expression. But before we turn to Clytie, I just want to mention another artwork by Evelyn de Morgan in Wightwick's collection that incorporates the sunflower. So this is the Bells of San Vito, which was painted later in 1891. You can see sunflowers feature here in the left foreground. Like with her earlier work, Clytie, the sunflower here is associated with a female figure in nature, but unlike Clytie, though, here, the woman is free of the entanglements of the sunflower, posing barefoot in the Italian countryside as if about to dance. It's easy to compare this painting by Evelyn de Morgan to the earlier Julia Margaret Cameron's photo. In both, women are wearing Grecian sleeveless loose dresses, they have their hair down, both suggesting this freedom and quite provocative, obviously very provocative for Victorian fashion standards. So de Morgan's painting here was exhibited at the New Gallery, Regent Street, in their fourth summer exhibition in 1891. The new gallery was founded in 1888 by the former directors of the Grosvenor Gallery, who resigned the previous year. So the gallery continued the ideals of the Grosvenor and was an important venue for artists of the Pre-Raphaelite and aesthetic movements. Evelyn de-Morgan supported the venue and alongside Lawrence Alma-Tadema joined the consulting committee. So it was an important venue for displaying aesthetic art, and it's noteworthy that Evelyn exhibited this work in that context. A review of this painting at the time, while not favourable, describes it as a story of a follower of Bacchus who, quote, came from the past into the present, revisited a town near Florence, but in 1890, but was scared away by the clang of the church bells. This represents the conflicting pagan and Christian beliefs, the new and the old together. Like with other aesthetic paintings, the artwork is not didactic. It's not about telling a story. It's instead wanting to evoke the senses, the sound of the bells, the movement of the dance, and to represent the beauty of the female figure and the Italian countryside, free from the constraints of modern fashion. And because we have the fact that we have the sunflowers here, and we do have her in this Grecian outfit, and they also therefore reference Clytie, but also act as a counterpoint. A woman here is not engulfed by the sunflower. Like Evelyn, other artists associated with the aesthetic movement were inspired by classical Greek mythology. They represent these classical allusions to dress, interior design and settings without any concern for historical accuracy. So finally, on to Evelyn de Morgan's Clytie. So the other artwork Evelyn created that represents the female form and sunflowers is here a depiction of Clytie. So you can here see on the left, the pastel sketch that Evelyn created is shown in the context of the honeysuckle room at Wightwick, next to an aesthetic Simeon Solomon pastel. In the middle, you can see a close-up of the pastel, and on the right is the final oil painting, which is now in a private collection. It has been speculated by some art historians that de Morgan chose the subject of Clytie because of the popularity of sunflowers as the symbol of the aesthetic movement and to show her own take on aestheticism. This painting was exhibited in 1887 at the home of the aesthetic movement, the Grosvenor Gallery. De Morgan's Clytie presents a popular Greek mythological figure depicted from a woman's perspective. The story is recounted in the poet Ovid's Metamorphoses, the themes of which inspired a number of Evelyn's artworks. Clytie here, a water nymph, fell in love with the sun god Helios. I'm sorry if I pronounce any of these names wrong. A lot of them I've only ever read, I've not spoken aloud, so I'm not entirely sure. I'll just kind of probably read them phonetically. And would gaze longingly at him as Helios drove his chariot across the sky from east to west, from sunrise to sunset. After 10 days of watching his daily movements, the god became tired of being under such scrutiny, and as the story goes, as Clytie awoke to find herself transformed into a flower, with her limbs rooted to the ground and leaves enfolding her, condemning her to a life of turning her face towards the sun. Her longing and fixation on the beauty of the sunlight embodies this aestheticism sacrificing everything for beauty. However, the metamorphosis is an act of male violence and control as a punishment for her devotion. Clytie is shown here by Evelyn with her legs rooted and engulfed by the sunflowers, and as the sun is setting, her head droops and so do the flowers, a human fading with the flowers. De Morgan's depiction of the myth emphasized the transformation of Clytie into a sunflower, alienated from her true home as a sea nymph, the sea which you can see in the distance that she's now separated from. So it focuses on the transformation rather than her ardent longing for the sun god. She is the focus of this painting, with the sun god perhaps symbolizing male power and superiority. The figure as well is in fact turning away from the sun. She also raises her arm to her head as if shielding her eyes from the sun rays. The drooping sunflower suggests her exhaustion from anguish. Her hair, the same colour as the sunflower, nearly touches the petals, and the viewer can imagine that in the next moment, Clytie being fully engulfed by the sunflower leaves and disappearing completely. Interestingly, from an aesthetic perspective, Evelyn foregrounds the sunflowers themselves. Unlike other contemporary representations like Leighton's depiction that we'll come on to later, in fact, the sunflower doesn't feature as the flower of Ovid's telling, but was adopted much later by the aesthetic movement and others to be the flower associated with Clytie. Ovid actually describes it as a purple flower, quote, like a violet, and Pliny also describes it as a blue colour, which it's been suggested is actually the flower, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this, Heliotropium indicium, Sunflowers are native to North America and were not found in antiquity in either Greece or Italy, making it impossible for ancient Greek and Roman authors to include them. Sunflowers were just not part of their native flora. So the prevalence of the depiction of Clytie as a sunflower in the late 19th century speaks to the aesthetic popularity of the plant and its connotations with the sun and with the female aesthetic figure. In part one of this talk, I also mentioned the queer subtext in the representation of Oscar Wilde as the aesthete, and a queer reading can also be made here of Evelyn's Clytie. So I've been doing some research about the depiction of the nude in her paintings and how a contemporary Victorian viewer and a modern viewer may interpret these figures. Evelyn de Morgan frequently represented nude female figures in her finished oil paintings, more so than other contemporary female artists painting similar scenes, who would, as was the practice, have first drawn from the nude and then clothed their figures, often in their finished paintings. A female artist representing the female nude can be seen through a queer gaze. Here, the sunflower brushes her crotch area, just covering, or in fact representing a caress, and may also speak to Clytie's desire for Helios. A Victorian Edwardian female artist's consistent representation of beautiful, strong, and often nude female figures, regardless of Evelyn de Morgan's sexuality, which we will never know, gives visibility to the lives of queer people who lived over 100 years ago. And the representation of Clytie and the sunflower as a sign of longing and unrequited love has also been speculated by historians to embody the constraints and silent forced on queer identity and relationships in Victorian Britain. For the queer aesthete, art historian Colin Douglas argues, the sunflower's association with unrequited love seems to take on an even more poignant meaning. As it was not easy for a queer aesthete to act upon their desires during the morally restrictive periods such as late Victorian England, the sunflower could be seen as a sublimation of that repressed sexual energy. There's a great thesis that goes into more detail about this if anyone's interested, entitled Domesticity in Queer Semiotics in the Aesthetic Movement by Colin Douglas Powell. The poet Dora Greenwell, who was greatly inspired by Christina Rossetti, also described the unrequited love of Clytie here in her poem and focuses, like Evelyn, on the motif of the sunflower. It's a passionate poem, and it has been argued that the movement of the flowers in the poem is a metaphor for sexual desire, alluding to the myth of Clytie and Helios again. However, it's also argued that she relates this sunflower to religious devotion. She mixes the pagan with the Christian, like in Evelyn's The Bell of San Vito. In this poem, the sunflower's resemblance to the sun, representing the Christian idea that God created mankind in his image, so the sun and the sunflower. And I will return to this Christian association with the sunflower later. So another artist that depicts Clytie, kind of more dramatically, I'd say, than de Morgan, is George Frederick Watts' canvas, you can see here, and bronze bust. They both illustrate the writhing body in the agony of metamorphosis. Emerging from flower leaves, his Clytie strains her body to follow the sun, awkwardly and painfully, twisting her head over her right shoulder. Her right arm is kept closely to her chest, while her left arm is bent sharply backwards. Both the bust and the paintings are of life-size scale, conjuring the physical presence of Clytie. And Watts really focuses on the physicality of the transformation. The musculature was actually, he drew from the Italian male model, Angelo Colorosi, a popular male model who worked with other artists like Lord Leighton and John William Waterhouse. So it's this kind of blending here of the genders in this depiction. G.F. Watts was another artist who was preoccupied by Clytie and repeatedly returned to the theme between the late 1860s and the 1880s, executing Clytie in a diverse range of media, from, you can see the bronze sculpture here on the right, to similar statues in marble and terracotta, to the drawings and paintings on the left-hand side of the slide here, so in ink, chalk, and oil on canvas. And Watts continuously chose to depict Clytie's moment of transformation from flesh to flower as fronds begin to creep up her torso. In all Watts' depictions, the sunflower, however, is kind of only really hinted at and downplayed. Yeah, so this kind of relationship between Clytie and the aesthetic movement is perhaps being downplayed by Watts. In the sculpture, it's only the stylized leaves that are shown, and in the oil painting, most of the flower is cut off by the end of the canvas. You can just see some of the petals creeping out from the top left hand of the frame. So Watts' painted version of the myth of Clytie appears to have never been exhibited or reviewed in Britain during his lifetime, unlike the sculpture counterparts he created, which caused a sensation when they were first exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1868. Interestingly, the bronze bust of Clytie here was Watts' first large sculpture in the round. And the marble that he presented at the Royal Academy was enthusiastically reviewed by William Michael Rossetti and Swinburne. So it's this kind of preoccupation with these depictions of Clytie in his work, which I find really interesting. By comparison, this final depiction of Clytie that I will talk about is by Frederick Lord Leighton, and it completely excludes the sunflower altogether, perhaps in an attempt to adhere more to the traditional Greek myth, and really highlights the focus on the sunflower and its aesthetic movement connotations in Evelyn de Morgan's art by contrast. So Leighton here focuses on the religious devotion of Clytie kneeling with her arms here outstretched. In an earlier painting of Clytie, you can see here that he created in the bottom left, she's completely dwarfed by the sky and sun. Instead, the focus is on that male god to be worshipped by the female figure. In the second version, so here on the far right, Leighton's final work, it was left unfinished in his studio when he died, and here we see Clytie worshipping, it's Apollo, not Helios, it's another sun god, before her metamorphosis has happened. And the artist, Leighton, explains this picture as follows. I've shown the goddess in adoration before the setting sun, whose last rays are permeating her whole being. With upraised arms, she's entreating her beloved ones not to forsake her. The language Leighton used here in describing his painting is intensely physical and possessive, and also appeals to the aesthetic movement's love of beauty, of sunlight above all else, although here kind of religion is definitely evoked and the sunflower is excluded. So moving away from Clytie, I now want to investigate how the sunflower's inclusion in art created by the Pre-Raphaelite movement was inspired by the aesthetic movement. So Maurice Bartali Stillman, who created this painting here, herself was part of the Anglo-Greek community in London, and here represents another Greek myth and a woman associated with the sunflower. Here they are seeking a lost love, and it's a heartbroken witch who's depicted. So the influence of or on aestheticism is embodied by William Michael's quote about this picture, which he describes having great poetic intensity, and the artist's fine power of fusing the emotion of her subject into its colour. The inclusion of the sunflower also evokes the movement, but Stillman here messes with the association with the Clytie myth. So the subject of this painting was based on Theocritus' second idyll. Theocritus was a Greek poet who is described as the creator of the ancient Greek pastoral poetry. And the poem describes two women in conversation while brewing a love potion. He writes about a woman, Simatha, who describes a love spell that she and her servant are performing, and at the same time she enacts it by reciting a series of incantations. She also speaks to Selene, the personification of the moon in the night sky, and tells her the story of her brief affair with and betrayal by a handsome young athlete. In the painting, it is dusk, that transitional time of day. Interestingly, it's also that time of day at which the sunflower droops and which Clytie is also transformed. In the right background of the painting is the sunflower. The sunflower here is turned away from the women and is turned towards the dying sun. An autumnal scene of oranges and reds and falling leaves, the yellow of the sunflowers in the background, to me does stand out. And the subtle inclusion of these sunflowers in this composition, created in 1870, so at the same time as Juliet Margaret Cameron created a photograph of the sunflower, alerts viewers, I think, the sunflower's connotations to love and devotion associated with the flower and the myth of Clytie with these women. It looks like a sunflower has also been plucked and sits on the love potion book itself. You can see just there in the left foreground, further associating the flower with an enduring love. which the female figure is hoping to evoke in a sort of a role reversal, really, of the story of Clytie. So the traditional roles of the men as the sun and the obedient woman as the sunflowers, which follow the sun, directly contrasts here to the actions of the women who are brewing the love potions for themselves to be the sun, around which the intoxicated men who ingest their potions will be devoted lovers. So this is an example of the sunflower representing kind of female empowerment and power in opposition to the myth of Clytie. Brewing a love potion over a simmering cauldron, the wine and other ingredients have been gathered, and one assumes the sunflower will be added to the overpowering concoction. For hundreds of years and continuing today, sunflowers are actually used to aid with fertility, happiness, love, and loyalty. Representing fertility, this doesn't necessarily mean physical fertility, but it can also refer to fertile ideas and creativity, so the perfect medicine really for artists. So moving on to another similar depiction of the sunflower and the female form, this time by Wightwick Manor Wine of Circe, which was completed in 1869, just before Stillman's painting. Down to Gabriele Rossetti's sonnet, which you can see here below the painting on the left, was created, quote, to have some record of Burne-Jones' work in my book, as he told Barbara Beaudeschon. I have tried in the first lines to give some notion of the colour, and in the last some impression of the scope of the work, taking the transformed beast as images of ruined passion, the torn seaweed of the sea of pleasure. You'll remember that in the picture, the window shows a view of the sea and the galleys which bear the new lovers and victims of this enchantress. So beauty and pleasure and corruption are the themes drawn out of Burne-Jones' painting. In the Greek myth of Circe, the goddess Circe was interestingly the daughter of Helios, who transformed Clytie into a sunflower. Described as a powerful witch, Circe first poisoned her husband, and then, as this painting alludes to, through the windows the viewer can see Odysseus' ships. Enchanted by Circe's song, the wandering sailors arrive at her palace, where they are welcomed with food and wine. But Circe is a powerful witch and has added, quote, beguiling juices to the wine, turning all the visitors into pigs, all except Odysseus, who arrives at the palace later. So interestingly here, Burne-Jones depicts the sunflowers surrounding the poisoned vessel, and they all turn towards Circe herself instead of towards the sun, perhaps emphasizing the metamorphous nature of the liquid. Circe's concentration is also reflected in the sunflowers. They all turn their heads tensely toward this event. As well as a reference to Circe's ancestry, could the sunflowers also reflect a solidarity between Circe and Clytie? The roles have reversed, and it is a woman in charge of the destiny and transformation of men, in opposition to the Clytie myth, or as retribution for what was done to her. Now, moving on to a Dante Gabriele Rossetti drawing here of Mary Magdalene. So we now return to the sunflowers association with Christian themes. In this biblical drawing by Rossetti, created in the late 1850s, so a bit earlier than the other artworks I've showed you and before the aesthetic movement, it's important to explore the meanings attached to the sunflower here. Interestingly, it's another form of transformation that is occurring. But like Clytie, it's a woman metamorphosing, but here it is of her own volition, and she is changing spiritually, not physically. So this artwork depicts another aspect of the sunflower myth, the association of the sunflower with Jesus and morality, in juxtaposition to the amoral aestheticism. Mary Magdalene is shown here on the precipice of converting and becoming a follower of Christ. In juxtaposition to all the frivolity occurring around her, you can see here in the centre, she's focused on pulling a garland of roses representing romantic love and the Greek goddess Aphrodite from her hair. She wants to distance herself from this. The lilies and sunflowers, in opposition to the roses, act as the gateway to Christ, from sin to purity. Mary rejects the roses and crosses over through the sunflowers and the lilies. You can see them here sitting here on the wall, just to the side of the door through which where Christ is. The three lilies, also adopted as a motif of aestheticism, are traditional symbols of purity and virginity. So in Annunciation scenes, there are often lilies present. The implication in Rossetti's picture then is that Mary Magdalene is turning towards a life of purity by crossing over the threshold that is represented by these flowers. To Mary's right, a second vase containing 3 sunflowers. Interestingly, Christ is directly right of the sunflowers, and these flowers, which always turn their heads towards the sun, resemble Mary, who has turned her back on the revelry and is transfixed by the radiant head of Christ. And that kind of radiant head almost kind of looks like petals surrounding the head of the sunflower. I also want to discuss another aspect of the depiction of the sunflower, this time in Edward Burne-Jones's work, but the sunflower's association with the masculine, here with the knight and his interaction with the sunflower. Also created in the late 1850s, like Rossetti's drawing, it's interesting to juxtapose these earlier works, as I said, with the later works of aestheticism to see the differences and similarities, particularly as Edward Burne-Jones was an important part of the aesthetic movement. So this drawing depicts the hero from Robert Browning's 1855 poem entitled Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came. You can see here the knight stands before the tower, having completed his quest, and serenades his arrival by blowing his horn. A multitude of sunflowers, all slightly different, surround the knight. He's engulfed in an array of never-ending sunflower heads, and more sunflowers feature in this artwork than in any of the others that we will look at. Burne-Jones's delight in the sunflower can be seen in this quote that he gave many years later. Do you know sunflowers, how they peep at you and look brazen sometimes and proud, and others look shy and some so modest that up go their hands to hide their brown blushes? And do you know their backs, the busiest back of any live creature? I could draw them forever and should love to sit for days drawing them. It is so right to make them talk mottos. They all look as if they were thinking. So this nightmarish tale, the knight battles in a seemingly hopeless quest, which is hinted at in the poem, may all be in his head to find this dark tower. Awful descriptions of what he and his fellow knights suffer in their quest are described in detail. And at the end of the poem, Roland sees the face of his dead friends and hears their names whispered in his ears who have not been able to complete the quest. Remembering their lives, Roland sees them, quote, there they stood, ranged about the hillsides to view the last of me, a living frame for one more picture, a sheet of flame, I saw them and I knew them all. Really shows sort of the grief around losing his fellow knights. And this living frame of old friends is represented here by the many distinct sunflowers, all representing a different knight. But they also therefore signal victory for this night. The sheet of flames may refer to the flame-like petals of the sunflowers. And for such a solemn scene, the sunflowers, though drooping at the end of the day with the sun disappearing, are still there to greet him. His quest perhaps may resemble the modern urban industrial and harsh condition in cities, with the sunflowers the antidote at the end, a return to beauty, a foreshadowing perhaps of the aesthetic movement's focus on the sunflower being beautiful. And it's interesting that it's the other male knights who are transformed into sunflowers. So once again, it's here about sunflowers associated with change and metamorphosis, but here it's men that have died and have become sunflowers. On the right here as well, it's this, I think, really cute and affectionate sketch that Burne-Jones did. So it really shows his love of sunflowers. It's a humorous sketch he drew in a letter writing to Katie Lewis, who was the young daughter of an eminent sister that he knew. And Burne-Jones wrote quite a number of letters to her and had these really beautifully, lavishly illustrated drawings in the letters. And here, with his humour, he parodies other artists. So Burne-Jones never focused on landscape painting. So the canvas he is painting here is not one that he actually created. And it might be a view of his garden or of a view of Katie Lewis's parents' garden. And it's making kind of fun of the popularity of painted garden pictures at this time. And the massive sunflowers here, out of scale, which he points to in the foreground with his brush, is kind of a humorous comment on the aesthetic movement's preoccupation with these flowers in their art, particularly as this was painted in the 1880s, so decades after the drawing on the left, at the height of the movement, whilst also perhaps making fun of his preoccupation with creating aesthetic artworks. I hope we have slight time for a slight diversion here. So this is not a sunflower, but this flower is nicknamed a wild sunflower. So as well as the myth of Clytie, the myth of Helen of Troy has an interesting place in the history of this wild sunflower. So if you don't know, the Flower Book by Edward Burne-Jones is a series of 38 round watercolours painted from 1882 to 1898. And despite the titles, the paintings do not depict flowers themselves, but they're a painting inspired by the flowers' folk names, their nicknames. So this here, Inula helenium, also known as elecampane. I'm sorry for any garden enthusiasts out there, I've probably butchered that name. It's also given the nickname the wildflower, and also is known as Helen's tears, which is the depiction here. Helenium derived its botanical name as a reference to Helen of Troy, and the old myth goes that when Helen of Troy cried and her tears landed on the earth, these flowers sprang up on the ground, hence the name. The association with fire and this kind of rebirth after destruction also kind of interestingly relates, I think, back to Childe Roland and the Mary Magdalene drawing, and this kind of idea of these flowers, representations of the sun, as representing rebirth. Also, quickly, the subject is Saint Friedeswide, the patron saint of Oxford, and the window shows this is a medieval story. So when she reached a marriageable age, she didn't want to marry. She was opposed to the idea and wanted to continue to become a nun and continue with her religious life. The story says that she was warned by an angel that the king's men were coming to claim her as his bride, and armed with divine protection, she flees, as this window illustrates. She's the pigsty shown here where she prays, and then she's shown fleeing, roaming away from home and safety and being protected by women. And interestingly here, Burne-Jones depicts the sunflowers in the stained glass window as a kind of protective shield for her and evoke that kind of idea of protection, which can also maybe relate to Edward Burne-Jones' depiction of the night and this idea of kind of female solidarity. So, just of time, we will end with Mary de Morgan, who is William de Morgan's sister, and her association with the feminine action and also the female rage she talks about in relation to the sunflower. So Mary de Morgan was a writer of children's fairy tales and was herself inspired by the aesthetic sunflower. In her fairy tale from 1877, The Hair Tree, of which you can see an image of on the right. In The Hair Tree, quote, "The magic seeds of the hair tree are protected by sunflowers, personified as female, with beautiful dreamy faces and bright golden hair." So this protection of women as sunflowers relates back, as I said, to other depictions that we've talked of today. However, in this poem, these sunflowers are also aggressive. So in opposition to the Clytie myth of the passive female figure, quote, "All at once a pair of beautiful white hands and arms were thrust out of the nearest stalk, and grasping him by the shoulders, began to pull him in with a strength he could not resist," cruelly kind of blocking the heroic quest in this tale. So one of the themes that Mary addresses in her fairy tales is that of the dangers of mass production, perhaps commenting here on the saturation of the sunflower motif in art. And also it's interesting that these female figures embodied as sunflowers then become an adversary for the male figure and kind of adopt that violence. So to conclude, I hope, unlike Mary's description of the sunflowers, that I haven't bombarded you with too many sunflowers and you feel attacked. So versatile and aesthetically striking, the sunflower symbol developed from the earlier biblical references to come to represent beauty and excess, unrequited love and female subjugation, but also female control. The sunflower embodies change and metamorphosis, as the aesthetic movement itself did. The sunflower was adopted in art to mean both, as I said, the subjection of women to beauty and their metamorphosis into an object, but also conversely their solidarity and protection of each other and their ability to turn the tables to control and transform men. From Evelyn de Morgan's Clytie and the Bells of San Vito paintings to Edward Burne-Jones' stained glass windows, G.F. Watt's sculpture to Maurice Stillman's brewing witches, sunflowers were the height of fashion, a symbol of a new art and lifestyle movement, and of the potentially of the perception of the changing position of women. I hope this talk has shown you the many ways this flower preoccupied British art in the second half of the 19th century. And thank you. This is the first time I've given this talk and the first talk I've given in a long time. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Hannah. We enjoyed it immensely. I certainly did. Thank you. And I think taking this emblem that seems quite a simple emblem, but actually really honing in on which artists have used it and why in their artwork actually uncovers so much more about some of the artworks and paintings. It's a really fascinating way of looking at things and finding common links between lots of different artists' work. So yeah, thank you so much. If anyone's got any questions for Hannah, then please feel free to put those in the chat box and I can put them to her. I think Hannah can see the chat box as well. So all your lovely thank yous coming through, she'll be able to see those.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. I've just seen about we can see the full screen. Thank you. I was really worried when my face was just in front of some of the pictures.
Yeah.
It was quite disconcerting for me. So I'm glad it was fine for you guys.
Yeah, that was fine. We could see and hear you beautifully throughout, Hannah, with those lovely images and slides as well.
Oh, thank you.
So do have a think about any questions for Hannah. I think my question, Hannah, would be, what was the most surprising link that researching this particular emblem allowed you to find between some of the artists?
Well, I knew of the Clytie myth, so I knew of that kind of woman having this devotional love and then being turned into this object. But it was really interesting when I looked at, I'll go back to it, when I looked at Marie Spartali Stillman's painting and then Edward Burne-Jones as well, and this idea of actually that turning it on its head. So the sunflowers, people at the time would have known that reference to Clytie, but here having it as kind of women who are in a sense going to transform men, I found a really kind of interesting juxtaposition on that myth, the kind of upturning it and a different idea, especially with Marie Spartali Stillman, a female artist, kind of taking that and reworking it and using different myth. I just hadn't really thought about it before. So yeah, that was really exciting. And also we're looking at the night. So the idea of associating, I know we talked about Oscar Wilde association with the sunflower, but here associating it as well with these, you know, what would be perceived as, I'll put this in quotes, kind of very masculine figures of these knights being represented by sunflowers too, is interesting to me when we think about the movement and the way Oscar Wilde is portrayed as quite aesthetically feminine in the depictions of him with the sunflowers. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, the fact that that was an insult, and then, like you say,
yes,
that's sort of been turned on its head by aligning that with the figure of the knight.
Yeah, definitely.
Sue's asked a question, Hannah, and actually I was thinking this, Sue, when the picture was on the screen. If you go back to the Spartali Stillman picture, Hannah, Sue's asked about the significance of the owl watching the two women. It's quite obvious, isn't it? It sort of catches your eye.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like it's Athena, I think, who's associated with the owl and this idea of knowledge and watchful knowledge. So yeah, that's a really interesting point. I was so fixated on sunflowers that it's kind of the aspects of the artwork I focused on. But yes, I think like the sunflowers, the owl is kind of in the distance and it's much smaller, but being at the top of the image and directly above the figure on the left, I agree. It's that idea maybe of the watching female and the idea of kind of being watched over and the knowledge that is being kind of shared here between these women in this creation of this spell. So thank you. That's a very good question. I hadn't really looked at the owl that much. I've just after this.
Sweet, isn't he?
Yeah, exactly. It's really lovely.
More thanks coming through as well, Hannah. So I hope you can see those.
Yeah,
yeah, I'll read it out then. If people can't see the chat box, they can hear it. So a question from Stephen is, when you were talking about queer interpretations, you mentioned a thesis that would be useful for further reading. Please, could you just repeat that so that people can jot it down?
Yes, I'm just trying to find it because my sheets are now not in order. Yes, it was, I should have his name on the tip. Yes, Colin Douglas Powell. So when I was researching, I found his PhD, and it's entitled Domesticity and Queer Semiotics in the Aesthetic Movement. So yeah, I can put that in the, can we put that in the chat? I can type it quickly.
Yeah, that would be great, thank you. And whilst you do that, we've got an observation from Jane that I'll read out. He says, excellent talk, thank you. She saw a recent exhibition on screen film about Mary Cassatt. One of the curators talking about the painting Woman with Sunflower, which we saw, had only recently had the title restored from Mother and Child, and the name change was a result of lots of research. So that's interesting to know, isn't it, that it's been previously entitled something that actually changes the meaning of that painting quite significantly. So thank you for that, Jane.
Yeah, thank you so much for that comment. I hadn't realised that, but that, yeah, it's really interesting. And I think it, once again, it just shows how the sunflower would have those kind of immediate associations for the viewer at the time of what Mary Cassatt was trying to convey, and how important it is having that in the title.
Yeah, it really, really shifts the meaning there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you so much for all your thanks. I've been so nervous about this because I've not done a talk in so long with being ill. So just, yeah, thank you. And this is the first time I've given the second half of this talk, so it's really kind. Thank you.
No, huge thanks to you, Hannah. It's been a brilliant insight, and I'm sure everybody has enjoyed it lots and lots. So because we're coming up to the hour, if there are no more questions, I will let everybody get off. So thank you very much again to Hannah, and for everybody for watching. This talk has been recorded, so the recording will be available on YouTube as soon as I get round to doing that, so probably early next week, and I'll be able to share it with everyone on our usual social media channels. So if you don't follow us on social media and you want to, we're at De Morgan F for Foundation on Twitter, and at De Morgan Foundation on Instagram and on Facebook.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, for the talks programme. It's a really, really fascinating mixture of talks, and thank you for hosting this space so well. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yeah, enjoy. Hopefully the sun where you are, like here. Bye.